Will Max Verstappen lose his number one? Are Audi and Cadillac set for a difficult 2026? And is Kimi Antonelli a world champion in the making? It's time for Racing News 365 answers your Prix Austrian Grand Prix questions. And welcome to Racing News 365 answers your fan questions, looking ahead to this weekend's Austrian Grand Prix. To answer your fan questions, I, Nick Golding, cannot do this video alone, so joining me as always for these fan questions video is none other than 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Absolutely Peace Coop. I feel like you're putting the piece up earlier and earlier before I even given your title, but anyway, Sam, It's an exciting weekend. It is the Austrian Grand Prix, a race which always delivers something controversial, it feels like. In last year, of course, the clash between Max and Lando. First of all, thank you to the fans. We've had some brilliant questions delivered into our social media team, so thank you for those. I have 5 of them here as always. But before we get on with that, Sam, interestingly, this weekend is the first Austrian Grand Prix under these current regulations not to be a sprint weekend. And as we've seen already in the early days of this week, we're recording this on Monday, by the way, several teams are introducing a rookie driver for FP1. So clearly, we're going to see something a bit different this weekend.
It makes for an intriguing prospect in many ways because the teams will have that much longer to get the cars into the windows that they want. As you say, there's going to be a couple of one debutant and one returning driver in FP1. So far as of recording, Alex Dunn, the Irish McLaren Junior, will be replacing Lando Norris in the first practice session, and Dino Bogdanovic, the Swedish driver, will be replacing Charles Leclerc for the second time this year after Bahrain, which means that the following 2 FP1 substitutions for Ferrari will both be on Lewis Hamilton's car towards the end of the year. But it's an intriguing prospect because, the field is closed up. And I mean, we're in, a similar situation to this last year at this very venue. But it's a very racy track. You're going to get a lot of action. We're quickly approaching the kind of the 1 minute mark per lap now. It's it's a very short lap at the Red Bull Ring. So it will be this really kind of intriguing prospect by having a more conventional weekend after so long without one. It's the first time under the kind of sprint shootout format that we've not had a sprint weekend in Austria. So there's a lot to look into going ahead into the weekend.
Right, let's go on with the questions. And once again, thank you to the fans who have delivered them into our social media team. Some brilliant ones, and I apologise in advance if I mispronounce any of the names. But let's get started, Sam, with the first question, which comes from Yenti Penty. And the question is, do you think there will be another driver change later this year? I'm going to quickly go first, and I'm going to say yes. I've got a sneaky suspicion we may see Sergio Perez in an Alpine this year.
Very interesting, and a very interesting question. So thank you for that. I mean, the 2 obvious places that you would look are Alpine and Red Bull. Yes. Alpine having already made, or both of them rather, having already made a driver change this year. So moving aside from potential force changes, looking at you, Red Bull, for that one, you're not going to see, as far as we know, any further changes to the Red Bull lineup, moving Yuki Tsunoda out, moving Isaac Hadjar up, so on and so forth. Helmut Marko and Red Bull at large have ruled that one out. So you're not going to see there. The Alpine one, I prior to the Canadian Grand Prix, I would have agreed with you, Nick. I would have said yes. But we saw a quite significantly improved Franco Colapinto, especially over one lap at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. And secondly, Flavio Briatore has vehemently backed Franco up to this point. As you can remember, the chaos and confusion at Imola when days after the press release came out saying that Franco would have 5 rounds in the car, which would bring him up to the Australian Grand Prix being that last one before a reevaluation over Doohan versus Colapinto versus Paul Aaron versus now potentially even Sergio Perez, as to what we're hearing. And that equation kind of leads into our next question in a minute as well. But yeah, essentially, Flavio Briatore then comes out and says, "Where's this 5-round thing come from? Like, what are you guys talking about? He'll have as long as he needs." And we're like, "They were your quotes in the press release. Like, you signed off on this. You might not have written it yourself, but you signed off on it."
Yeah.
So yeah, an amusing situation. But I'm starting to feel like they will give Franco the time, whether or not that's the right decision, especially with someone like Sergio Perez waiting in the wings. I wouldn't necessarily say it is the right decision, but I think they will stick with them.
Time will tell. Next question comes from TYSC 2010. And the question is, do you think a Cadillac and Audi will be competitive straight away in their first season? And this is an interesting one, Sam, because as we were just discussing off camera, you have Audi coming in, of course, as a brand new power unit supplier, but in a well-established team and, of course, in state. Currently, he'll become known as Audi next year. Whereas you've got Cadillac, who'll be a completely brand new team, but obviously being a Ferrari customer, at least for the first couple of years. So an experienced powertrain supplier in a brand new team. It's, two complete opposites, but both with a new feature in the team and then an experienced part as well. An interesting balance, I think, is going to be to see next year.
It certainly will be fascinating. It won't be as simple as being able to see side by side which is more important to success. Power unit versus chassis. It's always far more complicated than that. Even in 2014, when there was Mercedes aced the power unit, they had a far better car than people gave them credit for because of how overpowered that Mercedes was. But yeah, I think realistically, you've got to look at Cadillac as a completely fresh start in terms of designing, but they do have a lot of experienced heads who have come on board to that project. So they're not without experience, but starting afresh will be theoretically a more difficult proposition. But for Stake, or Audi rather, Audi could completely get the power unit side of things wrong. That is something that, Audi haven't done recently in F1. I can't think off the top of my head if Audi has had a power unit in F1. Well, it's not a power unit, but an engine. This is how much they've evolved.
Yeah.
So it will be difficult for them to be competitive. I think it's a fair claim to make that they're probably going to be the back markers if there's going to be any early in the year, probably looking at the 10th and 11th spot. What is interesting, though, is that as of recording this, and news may well have broken, we don't know if it's going to break or what the situation is, but we could know a little bit more about the Cadillac driver lineup by the time this video is released, because Valtteri Bottas hinted at quite strongly, a little teaser video they shared to social media, that he could be about to take one of the Cadillac seats for next season, which is a very strong move from them. They're bringing in an experienced driver who will help shape the project over the next 6 to 9 months before we get into the season proper in 2026. So potentially a good signing. But to kind of link that back to the previous question, doesn't necessarily mean that Sergio Perez is out of the running for the other seat, but it could also mean that Sergio is more likely to be heading to Alpine, which is, further evidence of how interlinked the whole situation in F1 is.
Time will tell. But sticking with the topic of 2026, because the next question comes from Wilson, who says right now, especially in qualifying, the gaps are usually within 1 to 1.5 seconds. How do you see that changing next year? Could there be a car that's suddenly several seconds quicker? And or do you think the gaps between teams could be much wider in the first season, since everything's new and each team still has to figure out what works best with their car and engine? Wilson, really great question. I've got to say, for me, quickly, I've got a feeling we are going to see some substantially bigger gaps next year, as I think you would naturally expect with the start of a new regulations period, let alone power unit regulations. We saw, of course, back in 2014, what Mercedes came out with. And of course, if you listen to all the speculation, the rumors, it sounds like things are going quite well for Mercedes once again for 2026. And of course, Audi, the ones, as are Red Bull, who obviously have got the biggest work to do, given that it's a brand new project for them, being a powertrain supplier in F1. So I do have a feeling that particularly in 2026, we will see much bigger gaps between the teams, particularly the likes of Q1 in the races, we could see one team dominating, but I do think, as we've seen in these current regulations, as we move on through the years, the gap between the back and the front will close up considerably. We're seeing now there are 3 teams who have won races this year. Ferrari, the only top 4 team yet to win a Grand Prix. So I've got a feeling we will see, quite an expansive amount of time throughout the field at the start of next season, and maybe even to come towards the end of 2026, we could see that gap reducing. I do have a feeling, though, and this links back to the previous question, I do think really for the first time in a good number of years, we're going to have at least one proper back marker team. I do have that feeling. Sam, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree that we're looking at at least one proper back marker, because there will almost certainly be at least one of the 11 teams that just gets it wrong.
Yeah,
we've seen it in the past. Obviously it was to a lesser extent, but in 2022, Mercedes just went in an entirely wrong direction with their concept. 1996, albeit not a substantial kind of regulations overhaul, but Eddie Irvine quite famously said when they unveiled all the cars, our Ferrari looks very different compared to everyone else's car. And you can kind of see quite early on if you've kind of departed from the norm. And absolutely right to mention 2014 Mercedes. Williams all of a sudden were really competitive because they had a Mercedes power unit in the back of their car. So you will see stuff like that. But again, as you mentioned, there's Christian Horner loves to talk about diminishing returns. It's one of his favorite phrases, and essentially what you see is these large gaps at the start of regulations when the understanding isn't quite there, and people will experiment with different ways because they haven't really seen what works yet. And then the best teams, they only have so far that they can go. There's only as fast as a car can go under that regulation set. So they're making kind of smaller improvements, but the teams that have more lap time to find can make these massive strides, which is why you see that convergence. Expect bigger gaps, and 1 to 1.5 seconds is not where it is at the moment. But there could be a car that's 1 to 1.5 seconds off the back of the rest of the field. Yeah.
Time will tell. Moving on to the next question, and it comes from Keira, who asks, let's say one of the McLaren drivers becomes world champion this year, but chooses not to use the number 1 in 2026. Will Max Verstappen be allowed to keep that number for next season? Sam, do you want to answer this one?
Certainly. So it's a very good question, because it's in some ways unprecedented, because when that rule came in, Lewis didn't use it. I think Sebastian didn't use it the first year, and then Lewis didn't use it. And then since then, Nico retired. Then since then, Max has not won a title, then lost it. So we don't know exactly. We do know. But what would happen is Max would have to relinquish that number 1, because in the regulations, it is set aside for the reigning champion if they so wish to use it. So Max would be reverted back to number 33, regardless of whether one of the McLaren drivers were to pick it up.
So essentially, if Oscar Lando wins the title, they can choose to run the number 1 or not. Whichever driver wins the title, if it's not Max Verstappen and they don't choose to use number 1, then we will not see the number 1 on the grid next season. Final question comes from Sophie. You've now seen 10 races from Kimi Antonelli. Do you think he's got the makings of a world champion? Maybe even more so than the likes of Russell, Piastri or Norris? I will go first on this one, because it's a really interesting question, and it goes back a little bit to a point we discussed, I think it's a few weeks ago on the podcast, where I said that in my eyes, the phrase future world champion gets thrown around now so often for various junior drivers, and of course Kimi Antonelli is one of them who's been given that title when he was in Formula 2 and of course in Freca as well. I've got a feeling though that yes, he has got the makings of a world champion. The fact he's doing what he is at 18 years old, I don't think a driver has been this impressive in their debut season, probably since Max Verstappen, in all fairness, who of course made his debut in F1 competitively at 17, initial debut at 16. I've just got a feeling that Kimi is potentially the next real deal, maybe alongside Oscar, if depending on, and this was interesting because actually next year's regulations, I think, are going to have a big say on these so-called future world champions, because if Mercedes get it absolutely right, then Kimi very well could be fighting for a world title next year alongside George Russell. Your prediction, Sam. But also, Oscar, if Mercedes have a good power unit, you've got to imagine that McLaren should be able to design a good car, so we can maybe enter a period of Oscar or maybe Lando being dominant. So for me, shortly, yes, I think Kimi is absolutely a future world champion. But what are your thoughts?
I think over the first 10 races, we certainly have seen the makings of a future world champion. It's always very difficult to tell because, things happen. Drivers get injured. They make wrong driver moves. But, I mean, the likes of Martin Brundle, you could probably, neither of us were around back then. But this is a guy who went toe-to-toe with Ayrton Senna, in championships before getting to F1. And then didn't quite make it, had an injury early in his career. Similar to the likes of Johnny Herbert, Olivia Panis, Jarno Trulli, all drivers who had injuries who then didn't kind of. And you look back at Jarno Trulli and Olivia Panis, you would never go, oh yeah, championship material, like yeah. They can kind of consign to their own place of F1 history. But what we're seeing early from Kimi is very strong. We're seeing what we kind of see every kind of 10 years or so, every decade, this generational talent. Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton. It's very rare to see someone so young, so good. And it's difficult to kind of make those direct comparisons with drivers in their first year because Oscar was quite an old rookie. He's only a year younger than Lando, which is remarkable, isn't it? Because Lando's first season was 2019, Oscar's was 2023. So, but it also bleeds into the kind of understanding and the argument that drivers have different trajectories. They have different peaks. To use a football explanation, Wayne Rooney peaked very early and also retired relatively early. It's the same with drivers. Some of them will be able to go on as long as Fernando Alonso. Some of them can't. It's just different. So what we're seeing is Kimi being very strong, very young. And you have to assume that he has and will continue to develop all the tools he needs to become a Formula One world champion.
Sam, amazing stuff. To all the fans who sent in questions, thank you very, very much. And make sure you do so as well after the Austrian Grand Prix, because we'll be recording this exact same video this time next week, but looking back at Austria and ahead to Silverstone. Of course, any thoughts you have on the questions we answered, let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, please do smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, and Sam and I will see you this weekend for the Austrian Grand Prix. See you later.
Thanks for joining us.